Good afternoon, KCAA listeners, and good afternoon and good evening to those listening to us on the live stream link. This is the Kathleen Wells Show. I'm Kathleen, your host, and today I'm delighted to have as my guest Grant Smith. I love having him on the show. He's been on before. He was on before to discuss his book, DIVERT, and today we're going to discuss his book, Spy Trade. Both books I've read. And you know why I love having him on the show is because his information, his research is so comprehensive, and his books are so chock full of information that we're not going to find anywhere. We're not going to find them, definitely not in the mainstream media, not in the alternative media. And so you have to read Grant's books to find out the things we don't know that is taking place in our government. So before I bring Grant on, let me tell you something about Grant. Grant Smith is the director of the Washington, D.C.-based Institute for Research Middle East Policies. This is an independent, nonprofit organization that studies U.S. policy formation toward the Middle East. Smith's research and analysis about trade, law enforcement, and opportunity costs have appeared in Antiwar.com, the Financial Times of London, Arab News, Kiplinger, Gannett, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Minneapolis Star. I mean, I can go on and on. In fact, it's also appeared in the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs, which is a sponsor for my Saturday show, Palestine Today. Don't forget to listen to that show, Palestine Today. Smith is also a frequent guest analysis on Voice of America, France International. He's appeared on BBC, C-SPAN, Al Jazeera, CNN, and Press TV. I mean, I could go on and on. Have I given you enough information? And Grant, did I say enough to induce people to buy your books because they need to get the information? Oh, I think we don't have Grant on the phone yet? Oh, well, let me tell you a few things. It's going to be a second or so. Let me tell you a few more things about Grant. As I mentioned, he's been on the phone. He's been on my show before regarding DIVERT, which was the first book that I read. And DIVERT is chock full of information, details how an American company, NUMEC, diverted and smuggled enriched uranium out of the country to Israel. That's what DIVERT was about. The book that we're going to talk about today is Spy Trade, how Israel's lobby undermines America's economy. This book shows that Americans' problem is not only Israel and its lobby, but perhaps more dangerously, the fact that they receive blanket immunity from prosecution. So, Grant, are you on the line? Huh?
Thanks, Kathleen. I'm on the line, and it's a privilege to be on your show once again.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted to have you because I said your information, both your books, DIVERT, which we discussed the last time, and Spy Trade, they're very well researched. They're chock full of information, and the information that people don't normally know, will not normally get in the mainstream and or alternative media.
That's true. And, you mentioned some of those mainstream media outlets, and for the record, they will publish some of the information I've done on trade and economic analysis. But as far as any of this other information, which is much more important, they don't touch that with a 10-foot pole. And I don't expect that situation to change anytime soon. So thank goodness for shows like this.
Well, so tell me, why won't they publish all this other information that is so vital for their American people to know?
Well, let's take as a case study the recent New York Times treatment of Glenn Greenwald's September 11 bombshell. As you know, and I believe you discussed this with Stephen Nagowski, on September 11, Glenn Greenwald told the world that the U.S. was passing intelligence on American citizens, unfiltered intel gathered about its own citizens directly to the Israelis. And the New York Times, in its infinite wisdom, decided that that wasn't a new or interesting piece of information, and so it didn't publish it, meaning that its readership and all of the newspapers and magazines that follow its lead in terms of sort of bandwagon journalism didn't pick up on it either. The reason they did that is they don't really want that type of information to get out, and they've treated the Israeli nuclear weapons program. They've treated doubts about the provenance of the Syrian gas attacks. They treat anything that falls into this category as possibly questioning the U.S.-Israel relationship with kid gloves and try and move it off the front pages. And that's the case with a lot of mainstream news organizations, and it's part and parcel part of the result and effect of having a lot of watchdog organizations from the Israel lobby constantly dogging them, criticizing them, trying to pull sponsorships whenever they get into this territory. They've been doing that for 50 years, and so the mainstream media is very cautious about how they approach these subjects.
Right, and in fact, in your last chapter, The Mobius Strip of Immunity, you write, Sonneborn Institute, NUMEC, the Jewish Agency, American Zionist Council, Iran-Contra, the United States International Free Trade Association classified document instrument, the Franklin Rosen and Weiserman espionage scandal, the Sybil Edmonds allegations all lie along a strip of Israel lobby operations twisting America towards expansive policies that repeatedly corrupt U.S. national interest.
Yeah, that's true, and I say a Mobius strip because if you really study these from the very beginning of the states, you can kind of see almost a three-act play. Act one, the Israelis of the proto-state and their supporters in the United States put together a giant smuggling ring, but later managed to get out of all prosecutions and win military aid. Act two, Israel steals materials and technical know-how to build nuclear weapons, and they're later rewarded not only with non-prosecution, but a U.S. policy of ambiguity toward their arsenal. And now we're in Act 3, in which Israel begins by stealing intelligence, a la Jonathan Pollard, the cream of the crop in terms of what the U.S. had at the time, only to now, as we know, later be given access in total secrecy to information that most Americans would be very uncomfortable even knowing that the U.S. government had collected upon them, but which is absolutely vital so that the Israelis can keep tabs and be able to front-run the United States politically, since they're absolutely dependent upon the United States for diplomatic and financial support. And so there is this common thread throughout all of these stories that if you put them together, there is criminal activity, there is behind-the-scenes maneuvering, and then there is finally delivery at U.S. taxpayer expense of what was originally either stolen or purloined.
Okay, so let's I sort of summarized, went to the last chapter. Let's go to the first chapter where you write that arms smuggling is at the root of U.S./Israeli commerce. Elaborate on that notion.
Sure. If you ask most Americans today, what was the biggest single arms smuggling network ever assembled upon U.S. soil? People might point to support for the conflicts between Northern Ireland, etc., the IRA, or they might point to some sort of illegal arming of Cuban exiles or something like that. But the fact of the matter is, David Ben-Gurion, when he was head of the Jewish Agency before Israel even existed, came to this country and met with 7 key industrialists, all Zionists, and put together the biggest and most extensive arms smuggling network that had ever been assembled in the United States, stealing or purchasing under false pretenses World War II surplus equipment, often shipping it through second-party countries in Latin America to Jewish fighters in Palestine. And this was for armaments-making equipment, ammunition-making equipment, a baby flat-top aircraft carrier, B-17 bombers, Lockheed Constellation transport planes. It was a massive, massive operation. And what you can see in the National Archives is that the FBI became aware of the arms smuggling network relatively quickly and had indictments for hundreds of people, including many prominent lawyers in New York, because they were basically taking funding from the Jewish Agency, a foreign entity, and buying all of this military surplus that they said they would either use for peaceful purposes or disassemble and scrap and shipping it overseas. And the interesting thing is that all of these prosecutions would later be unwound in secret as the organizations put together a war chest to fight within the Justice Department and politically any accountability for violating the U.S. Arms Export Control Act and Neutrality Acts. And so this sort of first act really taught the organizations, some of which are still with us today, such as the Jewish Agency, that they could get away with this kind of thing, that there could be utter impunity if they could only reach out politically and pressure the right judge or lean on the right person at the Justice Department, often by other judges or other Justice Department officials who happen to identify with their cause. And so it really created a real sense of impunity in terms of being able to violate, at this time, the U.S. foreign policy and be able to really put together an operation that would later go legit and become the Israeli military purchasing facilities and it later even receive taxpayer funding.
And then after that, after we talk about arms smuggling, in your next chapter, you go to the Iran-Contra affair that took place during the Reagan administration and how Israel's covert operations during this incident was completely downplayed in the U.S. media.
Yeah, those files, by the way, are still classified. But when people think of arms Iran-Contra, they don't think of Iran-Israel-Contra Washington, which is what it should be called, but it's a mouthful. Mm-hmm. But we really kind of put together the beginnings of the arms sales, which really had a lot to do with Israel's interest. Before the fall of the Shah, the Israelis were running the Savaks interrogation centers in Iran. They were selling massive amounts of weapons. They were putting together advanced missile technology for the Shah of Iran. And so they were trying to really retain their ability to sell into the only Middle East oil exporting country that was an ally of Israel before 1978, 1979. And the intellectual authors of the idea of selling U.S. arms to the Iranians, which had been given at U.S. taxpayer expense to the Israelis, selling them with the idea that some hostages being held by Islamic Jihad in Beirut would be released. All of this was really intellectually authored by a group of Israelis who had been trying to think of how they could reopen their lucrative arms export deals to the Iranians. But this chapter has been written out of U.S. history, and it was immediately taken off the table by congressional investigators. But I get into it, and I think it's important because Israel was not only willing and able to function as sort of an offshore center for circumventing the Boland Amendment prohibitions on U.S. aid to the Contras, but it was the intellectual author of the idea of selling massive amounts of advanced technology to the Iranians, being able to keep this horrific war between Iran and Iraq going without regard to either side, really, in the name of preserving access to this market that the Israelis wanted to get back into. And so I think it's important to show how, in this case, an administration willingly or semi-roped into a scheme that has been tremendously detrimental to U.S. credibility, but also, once again, gave some of the lobbies enormous prestige and the idea that they could really do anything and get away with it. In fact, as Iran-Contra was unwinding, Stephen J. Rosen, who later surfaces in an espionage prosecution of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, was trying to get into the White House and explain how they could wriggle out of the Iran situation, as correspondence that came out last year shows. So there was a lot of involvement, but not any accountability, and the main documents are still not available.
The main documents are still not available.
About the Israeli ends, right.
Right. About their Israeli threat in the Iran-Contra matter, is that?
Exactly.
Right. However, you do provide extensive evidence, and your book, Spy Trade, has a lot of classified copies of a lot of classified documents, and you provide extensive evidence that AIPAC operates as a stealth foreign agent of the Israeli government. And one example is the United States International Free Trade Agreement, where AIPAC committed economic espionage. So elaborate on that.
Right. So we obtained some documents about an FBI investigation into the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee. Again, this is a group that has been under constant pressure in its earliest days to register as a foreign agent of the Israeli government. It was founded by a formerly registered foreign agent of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Isaiah Kennan, and it functioned as an unincorporated lobbying group of the American Zionist Council up until 1962, when that organization was ordered to register as a foreign agent, and they quietly split off and incorporated 6 weeks later. So they've always had this connection to the Israeli government, and in 1984, the Israelis wanted tariff-free access to the U.S. market, and that would be a tremendous benefit to their exports into the United States. They didn't want to really offer reciprocal U.S. access into their market, and so 70 U.S. labor and industry groups decided they didn't want that sort of deal to go through, and they put together all of their objections to the International Trade Commission, a Washington, D.C. government organization that was managing negotiations, and listed how it would affect their market share, how it would affect their supply and their production costs to be competing with Israeli state-owned companies. They put a lot of trade secrets and secret market data into this opposition document, which was then classified by the U.S. government and to be considered only by the executive branch. Well, an Israeli Minister of Economics by the name of Dan Halpern surreptitiously obtained all of these trade secrets, passed them over to AIPAC, which then launched a massive PR campaign to all of the key Congress people and all of the key constituencies in Washington, D.C., using this data against the American organizations, industry and labor groups, including the AFL-CIO, Monsanto, Sunkist, all well-known U.S. organizations that didn't want these trade preferences to pass. So fast forward, the formerly balanced trading relationship between the United States and Israel has turned into a cumulative, through May of 2013, $100 billion deficit to the United States. It averages about $10 billion per year in Israel's favor because of these one-sided trade concessions. If you think about the 2012 deficit, it's equivalent to about 39,000 U.S. jobs that, rather than existing here, were simply transferred over to Israel in the form of benefits to allow them to accelerate their exports while ours are restricted. So it's an agreement that had real costs, but at the end of the FBI investigation for espionage and theft of government property, even though there was a solid case, as it usually does, the Justice Department declined to go to a grand jury and get any sort of indictments to those who were responsible.
Yeah, so Israel and its covert operatives have always eluded legal enforcement, has always eluded the Justice Department being able to come down on them with indictments and with complaints generally. And if the few cases where that did occur, you write, the sentences were de minimis, so to speak.
Well, in this case, yeah. The one example of indictments actually being handed down against this particular organization, AIPAC, which is a current iteration of, many organizations, but was the indictment in 2005 of Stephen J. Roseman and Keith Weissman. They had stolen national security data that, as Steve Rosen said, would help them convince America that Iran was engaged in total warfare against the U.S. and Iraq, necessitating an immediate U.S. attack on Iran. He was caught. He was indicted. The prosecutors had a bulletproof case. But over time, there was a massive lobbying campaign, the normal accusations of anti-Semitism by the Anti-Defamation League, massive amounts of rabbis writing protest letters to the Justice Department and President. And before it could go to trial, just a couple of months, the Obama administration swept in with new political appointees at the Justice Department, and the case was quashed. Although the two perpetrators, Stephen J. Rosen and Keith Weissman, didn't go to trial, they were never really exonerated either. It was simply quashed the case, and it fell apart. So, you know, in the one case where there could have been a real examination of AIPAC practices, the Justice Department once again failed the American people.
Once again, failed the American people. Well, we're going to take a break now. Hey, let me ask you, Grant, how do you feel about taking phone calls?
I feel fine about taking phone calls.
Okay, so I'm going to give out the call-in number. If any listeners out there would like to call in with questions or comments for Grant Smith, please feel free to do so. That's a toll-free number, 888-909-1050. And also I would like to say that when we come back from the break, we're going to discuss 5 dirty tricks AIPAC uses against Congress. You have that piece listed on your site, right, Grant?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Go ahead.
Easy to remember, 5 points.
What did you say? I missed that.
I said 5 points are easy to remember than 60 years of history.
Oh, okay, so we'll have 5 dirty tricks AIPAC uses against Congress when we come back from the break, and we'll open up the phone lines. We'll be right back. Welcome back, and I'm speaking with my guest, who I'm delighted to have, Grant Smith, who is director of the Institute of Research Middle East Policy. His first book that we went over on this show when he first appeared as a guest was DIVERT. It's an excellent book. I recommend it highly. And now we're discussing his book, Spy Trade. And we're also going to discuss the 5 dirty tricks AIPAC uses against Congress. But before we do that, we have a phone call from David in Vancouver. Hi, David.
Hi, Kathleen. Thank you for taking my call.
You're welcome. You have a question for Grant?
Yes, please. Mr. Smith, first of all, I want to thank you so much for alerting the American people to the fact that Israel is not a friend of the United States. Not only has Israel perpetrated all the criminal activity that you've discussed earlier, but Israel is the primary reason that the United States is involved in several wars in the Middle East and beyond. Are you aware, sir, of a Israeli policy plan written by Israeli strategist Oded Yinon entitled A Strategy for Israel in the 1980s?
Yes, that's an excellent reference.
Okay, would you please comment on Israel's plan to have the United States essentially destroy every country that challenges its illegal expansion and ongoing aggression and domination of that part of our world? Thank you.
Sure. Basically, the Iran plan, and then we can talk about the clean break plan as well, is basically a strategy for Israel to atomize its Arab neighbors into conflicting sectoral conflict so that they don't present any sort of real threat to Israel. And then subsequent to that, you had the neoconservative clean break plan in 1996, which was presented to Benjamin Netanyahu by American neoconservatives such as Douglas Feist, Richard Pearl, David Wormser, which really called for challenging the Syrians in Lebanon, getting them to withdraw, putting economic sanctions on the Syrians, challenging Iraq, neutralizing Iraq, also challenging Libya, just a whole scorecard of military activities, which as soon as they were empowered in the Bush administration, they began using U.S. military force to accomplish. And so back in 2003, we did a presentation on Capitol Hill about the clean break plan, that people were pretty surprised, and I believe a lot of people, as we were going into Iraq, were surprised that this had been in the works for quite some time. So those are both excellent references so that people can really see sort of the foreign provenance of a lot of what is sold as U.S. policy.
Hey, thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you, David. Why don't we take another call from Steve from Corona. Hi, Steve.
Hi, how you doing?
Good.
Good. I wanted to ask Grant a question about Israel having built the nuclear reactor in the Negev south of the town of Dimona. CIA had uncovered evidence and all that. It was claimed it was being built as a textile plant, but the bottom line being is they found deposits of low-grade uranium within their own desert and were able to extract, process, and that. Wonder if Grant would comment on that.
Yeah, sure. Well, you gave the basic outlines, but the United States, by the early 1960s, had detected the fact that the Israelis were busy building a nuclear reactor in the Negev, as you say, close to the town of Dimona. But they do not get the majority of their driver material from Dimona. You had the Plumbat affair, which is a diversion of yellow cake from Europe through an extremely intricate nautical operation. You had the purchase of yellow cake from Argentina, which could be processed into ore for Dimona. And then you also have the loss of 339 kilograms from a plant that was run by a couple of Zionist Organization of America executives here in Apollo, Pennsylvania, which the CIA also picked up traces of that Portsmouth signature U-235 outside the Dimona plant, leading them to conclude that all of that diverted uranium had wound up in Dimona. So, like it or not, a lot of countries have been roped into, not so much the case with the French, but roped into helping Israel become an undeclared nuclear state. And, of course, this is always left out of U.S. mainstream discussions about, regional balance of power. If you watch Fox News or listen to NPR, you'd think that the Iranians already had nuclear weapons and that the Israelis are cowering without any deterrent, when in fact it's the opposite.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Stephen. So, Grant, let's go over the 5 dirty tricks AIPAC uses against Congress. Give us those.
Sure. Well, there are basically 5 factors that Congress people have to take into account. Back when, for example, there was a tight race with Alan Cranston in California back in 1986, you had former AIPAC executives put together a spoiler candidate by the name of Ed Vallon and illegally fund him with hundreds of thousands of dollars to draw votes away from Cranston's opponent. And so Cranston was a workhorse for the lobby, giving loan guarantees, giving all sorts of free aid, and by staging this corrupt campaign in which someone was convicted of a felony, but Cranston was never derailed, they managed to get a person into office who shouldn't have gotten into office. They have also used AIPAC Deputy Director Elizabeth Schraer was found illegally coordinating supposedly independent PACs, which in fact AIPAC had set up and funded or had donors fund to push over the edge candidates that they wanted to see win. And so the dirty trick, number 1 of AIPAC, is really being able to threaten members of Congress by means of scorecards, counting every vote, with members of Congress knowing that if there is ever election fraud or any sort of this level of election manipulation, that there won't be any prosecutions. And that's the story of both of these cases. There were FEC complaints, court actions, but nobody ever really unwound the results of the dirty trick. So election fraud's dirty trick number 1. Dirty trick number 2 is really the fact that AIPAC is operating as a tax-exempt religious charity. It applied for charity status in 1967. Again, this is several years after splitting off from a foreign agent that ultimately completely disappeared as AIPAC assumed its foreign agent lobbying. And so members of Congress, and this is a dirty trick, they can never say, well, we're opposing this foreign interest, foreign government lobby. They have to weigh whether they want to be seen fighting a religious charity with all the sort of baggage that has going with it. So that's sort of dirty trick number 2, just the way it's structured when it shouldn't be structured that way. Dirty trick number 3 is stealing opponent's secret and using them against them in media campaigns, and the key case for that, of course, is the theft of the trade secrets in order to win trade concessions. Any member of Congress is going to fear that sort of penetration of their own offices and having their own secrets used against them, particularly because AIPAC demands that a lot of representatives that have won using its political action committee cash have AIPAC interns on their staff that sort of function as little spies to see what they're doing. Dirty trick number 4 is that AIPAC is willing and able to, with impunity, use national defense secrets without having any consequences. And one AIPAC director by the name of Morris Amate actually stole Pentagon secrets about a planned missile sale, which he used in a media campaign to quash the sale, almost driving Jordan, which was an important U.S. ally, into the hands of the Soviet Union. But, of course, he never suffered any consequences. And because of that, members of Congress have to worry about being and run by the dirty trick of leaking classified information. They receive classified briefings, but they can't leak them to the press, but AIPAC certainly can. And then finally, this aura of criminal immunity. Back when the AIPAC espionage indictments were still in effect, Congresswoman Jane Harman was picked up on a federal wiretap telling a Israeli foreign agent that she would simply waddle in and get that prosecution quashed. And so because the Justice Department later dropped that prosecution, sort of dirty trick number 5 is members of Congress have to fear that they can be targeted with all sorts of dirty tricks, but that there won't ever be any consequences for AIPAC if it's the one orchestrating them, because this has a long record of being able to evade that sort of thing, even when it's found out. Even when it's got its hand caught in the cookie jar, there are never any consequences. So people can look that up. There are fun little graphics in the article, 5 dirty tricks in AIPAC. That thing is all over the Internet now.
Oh, is it all over the Internet now?
Absolutely. That was a viral essay. Was
it really?
Absolutely.
Well, I have to confess, I tweeted it a few times, too. Do you say tweeted? Yeah, I tweeted or twittered.
Yeah, that helps.
Okay. Okay, we're going to take another break. Let me give out the call-in number if there are any listeners out there that like to call in for questions or comment with Grant. The number is 888-909. This is a toll-free number, 888-909-1050. Feel free to call in with questions or comments for Grant. And when we come back from the break, we're going to touch on Snowden's revelations. You want to touch on that, Grant, when we come?
Absolutely. I think we should talk about Syria a little bit, too.
Okay, sounds fantastic. We'll take a break and we'll be right back. We'll talk about the 2 S's, Snowden and Syria. We'll be right back. Welcome back. I'm Kathleen Wells, your host of The Kathleen Wells Show, and my guest today I'm delighted to have is Grant Smith, who's the director of the Institute Research Middle East Policy. We're talking about all the dirty tricks that AIPAC uses to influence Congress. We're also talking about arms smuggling and espionage, military and economic espionage, and how that adversely impacts the American economy and American jobs, and how Israel has basically escaped with impunity. Is that the right way to say it? I may have said it wrong.
Yeah, I would say impunity.
Okay, so now we're going to touch on Snowden and what he was able to reveal about intelligence transfers to Israel. Elaborate on that.
Right. Well, I just wanted to mention that probably the most stunning thing that the Guardian released on September 11th was the justification for why the National Security Agency is passing unfiltered wire intercepts, internet intercepts, all this raw intelligence to the Israelis. And buried within that article was the justification. There's a top-secret NSA memo dated September 2007, which says that we're doing this because, quote, the survival of the State of Israel is a paramount goal of U.S. Middle East policy, unquote. Or if you simply slot in the definition of paramount to make it more clear, what it means is the survival of the State of Israel is more important than anything else, that it's now the supreme goal of U.S. Middle East policy, which I found to be quite surprising, since although it's frequently referred to as an ally, there is actually no formal military alliance between the United States and Israel, as Ray McGovern, the CIA analyst, frequently mentions, and also the fact that Americans don't seem to have ever had a chance to have a referendum on that policy, and it's never really been put to a vote. There's a 2012 poll that says 65% don't want to even take sides in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and in the same poll, some 41% would like to see our aid to Israel, which is the top-line foreign aid recipient, of around $3 billion plus a whole lot of secret aid. They don't want that to be continuing either. And so the thing that was surprising about the Snowden revelations is that it's wildly out of sync with current U.S. thinking and preferences about how to go about the conflict. They're basically putting a single goal ahead of all others, to the extent that they're even willing to violate American privacy to ship all of this data overseas so that the Israelis can use it to continue getting an edge in terms of their biggest benefactors.
Well, I mean, hasn't Israel's interest always been tantamount? In fact, you open your book Spy Trade with the fact that Harry Truman received something like $1 million or $2 million in cash from a Jewish American so that he would rush through the statehoodness of Israel.
Well, he was surrounded by lobbyists and cash bundlers. The person in question, his name was Abraham Feinberg, and he did help organize what was known as the Whistle Stop campaign that saved Truman's election bid. As you know, Truman entered office because of the death of his predecessor and then recognized Israel and was later rewarded with all of this largesse, even as his key government officials were warning against creating a state, that it would result in never-ending conflict and alienation of key allies in the oil-producing region. So it's a fascinating story because Abraham Feinberg, this powerful lobbyist bundler, was later the key North American fundraiser for Israel's nuclear weapons program. He was above and beyond the law so far, and even caused problems for LBJ, who had hundreds of thousands of dollars of Feinberg cash in his safe that once had to be moved because of a minor criminal prosecution. And so, you know, the untold story of cash bundlers who are inside the White House and have the ear of the president on all of these key policy issues is something the American people are not aware of. All they're aware of are the disastrous results, but they never really understand how the constant executive-level lobbying of these well-funded organizations, which, again, have attained a lot of their power through illegal means, they don't understand how that really affects U.S. policy, and they pay a price for their ignorance.
They pay a price for their ignorance, and that's why they have to get your book to get the intricacies and the machinations and the details and the specific. They have to get Grant Smith's Spy Trade. And in your book, you have a quote by Colonel Lawrence Franklin regarding an Israeli lobby operative in the U.S. He said, this was his quote, "He is beyond good and evil. They are not subject to the law like the rest of us are."
Yeah, well, he could be talking about Sheldon Adelson, Haim Saban, Abraham Feinberg. I mean, I could continue a list of people who have been instrumental in pressuring presidents to, not indict Mark Rich when he was involved in all sorts of Iranian oil deals, but was also a Mossad asset. Another American, such as Hollywood producer Arnon Milchan, who helped a smuggling ring get nuclear triggers out of Huntington, California, in a ring that also had the assistance of a young Benjamin Netanyahu. Lawrence Franklin is right. There's a certain level of lobbyists/operatives who have been immune for so long that they've become known to people who have gotten into trouble, such as himself, who had no such friends in high places. We're at a moment right now, kind of like in the Bernie Madoff scandal, where Harry Markopolos was continuously going to the SEC saying, "Can't you see what's going on? This is a Ponzi scheme. Things are going to fall apart. People are going to get hurt." And the SEC is playing the role of the Justice Department, ignoring, trying to, pass time, not wanting to deal with any of this. It's the same situation.
Turning a blind eye. So let's turn to Syria now. You say the Israel lobby has become a major determinant of both U.S., Middle East, and broader economic policies. How do concerned Americans influence policy in an environment where dominant groups achieve and wield power by floating the law decade after decade with impunity? What is the future of our nation if we allow such corruption of the rule of law to continue? Important questions go utterly unexplored in the establishment media. They are not debated by Congress. Well, Syria is a
ray of hope, absolutely, because what happened?
Exactly. The American people spoke.
They spoke, and their calls were coming in at a rate of 100 to every AIPAC call. And it's too late to say whether this is going to stick or not. The Israel lobby likes to get its way behind the scenes. It doesn't like to be drawn into a conflict out in the open like this, where it has to compete one-to-one with outraged American voters. It would much have preferred the strikes to take place and no pass to Congress, but this is what it was left with. But I think some of the tactics that are used to bring down a dictatorship can certainly be brought to bear on the lobby, and that is, mass petitions and protests like we saw with the Syria case, people actually calling the Congress people for the first time, declarations of indictment, calling AIPAC what it is. More and more you're seeing people who are only peripherally aware of its history saying, yeah, well, it's a foreign agent and it should be treated as such. And, symbolic public acts such as the protests that take place every year in March in front of the convention center with hundreds and hundreds of people gathering as a counter-protest to what's going on at the American Israel Public Affairs Committee formal proceedings, and really exposing through alternative and social media what's going on. An article like, the 5 Dirty Tricks can get out there in front of millions of viewers, even as the New York Times is studiously ignoring the Israeli intelligence story. And that is what has to be done. People have to become participants as opposed to sort of passive viewers of what's happening.
Yeah, I saw many articles about Israel, the lobby, AIPAC, sending hundreds of lobbyists to Washington, D.C. to push Obama to strike Syria. I saw many articles about that.
Yeah, but absolutely. And that's, that is absent the countervailing force of public phone calls and counter demonstrations that would have been successful just as it usually is. But what you don't see is any sort of real serious examination of key questions like where did AIPAC come from, and why is it that it has been able to engage in all of these strange activities that not even groups like the NRA or AARP, the fearsome retiree groups, engage in and get away with it. What is it about this lobby that continuously has it tied to espionage activities against the United States? You'll never see any of that And so the job really isn't done until people are given a full perspective in every article written about AIPAC, about its true origins and past activities. Otherwise, they believe it's just what it says it is, which is just an apple pie American interest group, which it absolutely isn't.
No, it's not. And in fact, President Kennedy wanted it to register as a foreign agent.
Absolutely, he did. And his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, and you can see these files online if you simply go to American Zionist Council, RFK. They were in a furious behind-the-scenes battle with the AIPAC predecessor, which was basically saying, you know, the Foreign Agents Registration Act and all of these other laws they're fine, but they were never intended to apply to Israel. And so there's always this continuing strain of appeal for special treatment, such as, you know, basically saying, use your prosecutorial discretion, allow us to continue our operations, don't make us register as a foreign lobbyist, which is what we actually are. And it's enough. It's too much. If Kennedy had won, if the United States Congress had been able to refer to AIPAC as what it was, a foreign interest lobby, and be able to determine all of its campaign funding flows and keep it out of U.S. domestic politics, we would be a different country, and the Middle East would certainly be a better place today.
Yeah, and you also write about when talking about bilateral agreements, the free trade agreement, that the United States has always had a advantageous, beneficial agreement with other countries such as Morocco and Singapore for decades. But for some reason, our agreement with Israel has been to our detriment. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, we have agreements with Bahrain, Morocco, Jordan, Oman, Australia, Chile, Colombia, Korea, Panama, Peru, Singapore, CAFTA, NAFTA. What people don't know is that the majority of our bilateral trade agreements produce a net benefit in terms of job creation because we export more than we import, as well as growing overall volume. Some of them, that's not the case, as with NAFTA. But the bottom line is the Israel agreement is not a free trade agreement. It's a locked-in set of unilateral benefits to Israel that allows them to export massive quantities of particularly diamonds and things they've always exported into the U.S. market without any countervailing responsibility to receive U.S. exports. And so if you look at the agreement, for example, it locks out many, many U.S. exports.
Yeah, and you gave an example of pistachios, like...
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the details are mundane, but the overall picture is it's not free trade. It's another form of aid, which most people were never aware that had been given at their expense.
Okay, we only have a few more seconds. Thank you, Grant Smith, for being a guest. You know, you're always welcome on the Kathleen Wells Show.
I really appreciate it.
It's fantastic. I want to recommend people to I read both books, Divert and Spy Trade, and also check out Grant's website, the Institute Research Middle East Policy. Thank you, Grant, for being a guest on the Kathleen Wells Show.
Thanks so much.
Okay, bye-bye.